Today, we do have a state economist, Damon Runberg, who will be sharing with us a PowerPoint slide presentation on a lot of different topics that I know are very important to each and every one of you. I think some of the information is just fresh today, that just got updated. But again, as we do with all our forums, the blue cards on your tables are our question cards. We try to leave 15 minutes to 30 minutes at the end for Q&A. So if you do have a question for Damon, please go ahead and fill that out, and we'll have someone stop by and pick them up. So with that being said, Damon, the floor is yours.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here in person. It's great to be on this side of the mountains. It turns out all of us state economists, we live in Bend, trying to insulate ourselves from Salem a little bit. No, I'm kidding. There's like 3 of us that live in Bend, though, chances are if you have any state economists come visit and talk to you, especially if one talks about forecasting the budget, that one, Josh Lehner, also lives in Bend with us. So we keep a tight little group over there. Yeah, I haven't spoken on this side of the mountains. Oops, I need to get on this side, right? So that the people on the Zoom can see me. I haven't been on this side of the mountains for a talk since COVID, and man, is it good to see you all in person. Good to be back on this side of the mountains for an in-person talk. The last estimate, I think over the course of the almost 2 years of Zoom talks and presentations, I did somewhere around 84 updates on the economy via Zoom, so I'm really tired of looking at my own face. And I'm glad that you're seeing my face, but I don't have to see it as well right now. So it's good to be here, and I think we could all celebrate that a little bit, right? I'm on this side of the mountains talking about a completely different trend than what I have experienced in my hometown of Bend. Although I'll say my hometown is Beaverton. I was born and raised there, but lived in Bend for the last 15 years. In Central Oregon, it's known for being one of the more volatile economies that we have in the United States, with the highest of highs and the lowest of lows. And as you know, we'll get to see some employment trends here in a second. Central Oregon lost 1 in 5 jobs during the pandemic, and they're already sitting with employment levels almost 3% above the pre-COVID peak. Completely recovered, just gangbusters recovery. That's not the narrative we have here in the Portland metro area. And we're going to talk first about some of the employment issues that we've been seeing. Employment and the recovery, what it's looked like, difficulty finding workers, etc. And what's, I think the narrative that we hear in the media and whatnot is that, man, Portland is struggling. It's a tough place to be. And when we're talking about Portland, the data that we're going to be focusing on is mostly the Portland metropolitan area. You all are familiar with that concept. Obviously, outside of Oregon, people hear Portland and they don't realize that the Portland metropolitan area is much larger than literally the downtown core, right? So when I'm speaking it, we're speaking the language of Portland metropolitan area is metro. We're saying Multnomah, Washington, Clackamas, Yamhill, and also Columbia. These are the counties that are included in the data that we're talking about here. So know that when I have some optimism, the optimism is for sort of the broader region, and we'll look at some details of sort of what Multnomah is doing to pull down some of the numbers, but that's where most of the discouragement, or whereas the negative numbers have been, is more the downtown core. But Portland is bigger than just Multnomah County. So with that, let's jump into what some of the numbers look like right now. So can I move? I see that they're not even seeing my face. Is that okay? I like to migrate, but what do the Zoom people see right now? They do see me. Okay, I won't move. I can move this way, okay. Okay, that's fine. I'll stay here, don't worry. I won't migrate. So, these are some of the headlines that we see across the state. This is what Oregonians are seeing about Portland today. The headlines, whether they're from, Coin, or whether they're from the Oregonian, or from even the Bend Bulletin, or from OPB. We're seeing headlines of workers, visitors still aren't coming back to downtown Portland. Urgency needed to fix the Portland economy. What else do we have here? A lot of, economic crossroads. Portland in an economic crossroads. Man, a lot of this language is pretty intense, right? It feels really a little bit scary, right? Like sorry, excuse my French here, what the hell happened to our town? If this is the language that we're using to talk about the local economy. Now, I don't think that these headlines are completely wrong, But I do think there's some hyperbole in the language that's there. I don't think things are nearly as doom and gloom as you might expect from the headlines that we see. If we cherry pick, I just cherry picked a handful of metropolitan areas, and we could look at sort of other big metros around the country and see what the job losses looked like in those metro areas and what the recovery has looked like through COVID. We're talking COVID trends here. So the blue lines represent the total losses, COVID losses during the pandemic, okay? So you could see at the very bottom here, I just once again, there's no rhyme or reason to the ones I picked. I just picked a handful that we might know the names of, right? We've all heard of Philadelphia. We've all heard of Seattle. Some of them are close by, some are not. Some of them are in more conservative states, some of them more liberal states. I just, like I said, a random smattering here. But you can see the blue line represents total job losses during the pandemic, and the orange line represents what the current employment level is compared to that pre-recession peak, pre-pandemic peak. And so if you're above negative, if you're not in the negatives anymore for the orange, it means you've recovered, okay? That's how we're reading this. So you can see, I threw a handful on the bottom here. You can see, Philadelphia lost over 17% of total non-farm employment. I don't know anything about Philadelphia. Sorry. I don't know why they were hit harder than we were. No reason to know. But if someone in Philadelphia has a good answer for that, I'm sure. San Diego, LA, you see these, the large the large California metropolitan areas hit harder than Portland, big time. We're sitting around the Portland metropolitan area, 14.5% of jobs were lost here locally. Once again, that's for the five-county region that is Portland Metro. Also includes Vancouver. So the Clark County numbers are roped into this as well. So we lost about 14.5%. Now, from this graph, you're probably thinking to yourself, well, geez, the narratives we hear about Portland, you would expect Portland to be at the bottom of this list, right? And that is absolutely not the case. We were sort of middle of the pack for this random assortment. Compared to the national average, Portland lost a larger number of jobs. But to be completely honest, every metropolitan area got hit harder than the national average. And we'll get into the reasons behind that in 1 second, why metropolitan areas were hit harder. But then you can go up and see some of the random ones I selected that sort of weren't hit as hard as us. So you see like Denver was pretty close, almost identical to us. Seattle fared a little bit better, Amazon. You keep going up and you can see, Phoenix and Memphis, a little bit more glancing blows. But even someplace like Phoenix still lost 1 in 10 jobs. It wasn't like they completely were insulated from the effects of the pandemic. And like I said, we switch gears and we focus now on where the recovery has been. And the recovery narrative looks pretty similar to the narrative of who lost the jobs in the beginning, right? There's not a huge deviation as far as of where the recovery pattern has been. Today, now we don't have the February numbers yet. Those will be released next Tuesday for the Portland metro area. But today we released the statewide numbers. We had phenomenal growth in February, job numbers. A lot of that, the Portland metro area is the elephant in the room for the state of Oregon. And so we know when those Portland numbers come out next week that it's going to have been a really good hiring month in February. So the job numbers got to come back. It's going to be lower than that. We're not longer going to be at 2.6% below the pre-pandemic level. It's going to be better. But needless to say, as of January, employment levels were down 2.5% or so from pre-pandemic peak. So we're still recovering here locally. But you look at where we are compared to some of these other metros, and you're like, gosh, we're a lot better than basically everyone in California, the big metros, I should say. Not that much different than, Seattle. And Seattle didn't get hit as hard as we did. So we've had sort of a faster pace of recovery here. And then you could sort of go up and you could see some of those, the Memphises, the Phoenixes. If we threw Boise on here, that would be, I didn't put Boise on here, but Boise looks like Bend, which is, the opposite. Bend was hit super hard and then recovered super quick. Boise was like, pandemic, what? And then, so no job losses, and then they've just rip roaring. So they look a little bit different. Like I said, this is a cherry-picked list a little bit to get the perception, though, that this idea that Portland is, sort of in the gutter, I don't think is a real narrative that we should be focusing on too much. I think we're in a pretty healthy trajectory for recovering. I'm pretty confident, but at least components of the Portland metro area are going to be fully recovered in 2022, this year. So why is it that metropolitan areas saw bigger impacts like this? Why did we see job losses that were in excess of what we saw sort of at the national level? It had a lot to do with industry composition, the composition of what a metropolitan area looks like, and things that are related to the pandemic. So first and foremost, they tend to have larger concentrations of jobs in leisure and hospitality, restaurants and hotels. Tourism is big components as well. Visitation, conferences, et cetera. All that stuff dried up for a period during the pandemic. Some of it was policy related. Some of it was behavior related. Regardless, leisure and hospitality was hit hard in all areas, regardless of policy responses. Another area that was hit hard early on, believe it or not, was healthcare. A lot of us didn't go to the dentist for 6 to 9 months, maybe. You let that cavity go a little too long or whatever it was, right? So we saw layoffs in a lot of ambulatory health services. Where do we see the highest concentration of health services in the United States? Big metropolitan areas, so that was hit hard. Smaller retail, so big box stores actually did pretty well, but smaller retail struggled during the pandemic. People weren't going to your downtown boutiques, right, because they didn't feel comfortable or safe or whatever it was. And then, this isn't a job loss component, but it feeds the demand for some of these other businesses, is the remote work component. So a lot of our downtown cores have lots of large office buildings. And when those workers aren't going to those office buildings, they're not spending their money in the downtown cores. And this is one of the issues with downtown Portland, more than this concept or this narrative that Portland's dying or something's going on. It's like, no, we just have a lot of workers who are not going to work every day where they were before. So they're not eating their lunch, they're not having these meetings or whatever it might be. And that's helping the leisure and hospitality industry when they're there, and it's hurting when they're not there. So I'm pretty confident that, as we start to see some in-person stuff come back more normal, we've already heard announcements from big employers in the metro area that you're going to start to see, it sounds like April, May, some more back to work, less remote work for a lot of businesses. So I think that's going to really help the numbers in the metro area overall, just getting those people back and engaging with the businesses that support those businesses, right? Sort of the indirect there. So looking at it a different way, let's zoom in on the metro area so that we get an idea that, when we talk about Portland Metro, there is a lot of different trends happening within the 4 or 5 counties that exist in this area. And I also threw Salem and Bend on here just so that you guys had a perception of sort of what other places look like. But there is an elephant in the room here. Do you see it? This bottom line here? So this is the employment trend going back pre-COVID all the way through January of 2022. And you can see we're sitting in Multnomah County, employment level is still 6.5% below the pre-COVID peak. That's Multnomah, and that is, a big county, has a lot of jobs. So that pulls the metro area numbers down quite a bit. But look at the other counties. We're here in Clackamas County, right? Yeah, just making sure. I was checking you guys, yeah. But Clackamas is doing the best relative to any of the other counties in the metro area. I mean, we're only sitting, this is as of January, we're under 2% off the pre-COVID peak. I'm 100% confident. I mean, you could take me to the grave on this one. Clackamas County will be fully recovered in 2022, jobs from the pandemic. I'm confident about that one. We haven't even seen the boon that will happen with mask mandates coming off yet. There's going to be, a certain level of the workers going back to in-person and going back to office jobs and the mask mandates coming off. Behavior changes, people feeling comfortable going in restaurants. All that stuff simultaneously is going to help the job numbers too, right? So we haven't even seen that benefit in the numbers, which probably won't actually show up in the numbers until, when did the mask mandate come off? What was the date? Was it the 12th? It's a little awkward, yeah, because we count employment based on the week that includes the 12th of the month. So I don't even know if the March numbers will capture it. It might show up in the April numbers. But either way, we're going to see some sort of good news from some of these shifts that we've seen. So here locally, I wouldn't be too worried. We're at a pretty good trajectory for recovery here locally in Clackamas County. Washington not far behind. Really, the 2 counties have done pretty well for metropolitan areas. Once again, it's Multnomah that's pulling down the Portland metro area as a whole. And I don't think, I don't live here, so I don't want to be a total critic here, but I've been to downtown Portland several times in the last few years. It doesn't feel like it's dying. I think it's okay. It's going to be all right. It's just, I think these industry composition issues are far bigger weights than we appreciate. And whether or not, the riots or the protests and all the social unrest stuff that happened, I honestly think that that's sort of got to be in the back of people's memories here sooner than we think. And Portland will do okay. But like I said, these pandemic effects have been really damaging to downtown cores, and Portland's not unique in that regard. Like I said, I threw Bend, Deschutes, and Marion Polk, Salem metro areas on here just for some context. To fully appreciate the crazy economy that I live in, it's the orange line here. 1 in 5 jobs, 20% of jobs in the local market were shed during COVID, and we're sitting up there about 3% above pre-COVID peak. Like I said, the highest of highs, the lowest of lows. Welcome to Central Oregon. Marion Polk County, so the Salem metropolitan area, is the only other metropolitan area in the state of Oregon that has recovered from the pandemic from an employment perspective. So it's not like everyone else has recovered and Portland's the one that's still like, dragging their feet behind. Medford, Eugene, I don't have on here. Lane County is actually pretty closer to Multnomah County than any of the others. Has a lot to do with the university though, right? The Corvallis area has struggled as well too. Enrollments were way down during the pandemic. Even when enrollments sort of bounced back this year, a lot of folks were still online. So you kind of need the students there. It's sort of like the online office job work where you're like, well, those workers have an induced effect, right? They're spending that money in the economy and that's creating jobs, inducing jobs. Students are the same way in places like Corvallis and Eugene where it's like, well, you could have online students paying tuition. That's great for U of O. But that doesn't help the restaurant down the street who relied on those students spending money at the restaurants and bars or whatever. So switching gears, talking about labor supply. There's been a lot of focus where we're saying, okay, we're not recovered from the pandemic. The metro area, whether we're here in Clackamas County, we're under 2%. The metro area as a whole, 2.5% below pre-COVID peak. And so we're not recovered, and yet businesses are having a hard time finding workers. Hard time recovering, and you'd say, well, if we haven't recovered yet, it should be easy to find workers. Where the hell are all the workers at? And if we're actually looking at the labor supply, the labor force, which is simply all the number of people who are employed combined with all the people who are unemployed, that's the labor force. That's the pool of labor that's out there. It's pretty fascinating. I like to stack it like this so you get an appreciation for how small unemployed represent most of the time in our economy. You could see the COVID surge here. We went from roughly 41,000 unemployed people in the metropolitan area to almost 170,000 in the span of 2 months. That's wild. We don't see that every day. There's a lot of the word unprecedented economists have used for the last 2 years to an excessive degree, and I fully appreciate that we overused it, but dang, it's been unprecedented from a numbers perspective. So we're bouncing back, but you can see really quickly this fat orange section got smaller and smaller and smaller all the way till today. We're sitting with around 53,000 or so, 54,000 unemployed workers. Yes, that's larger than the 41,000 that we had before. So we do have a larger supply of unemployed workers in the metro area today than we did before the pandemic. So the supply is larger. Now, like I said, that number relative to what it was before, not that big, right? We don't have a huge glut of unemployed workers. We just have more. And it's also important to remember that before the pandemic began, we were at record low unemployments historically. Never seen rates of unemployment as low as they were right before the pandemic. So the fact that we have a slight excess isn't necessarily optimistic for labor supply. We kind of wish we maybe had more labor supply. And then what's even crazier, though, is you can see despite higher levels of unemployment, we also have more employed workers. But I just showed you this that said our businesses, the jobs in local businesses haven't recovered yet. So how could we have more employed workers, yet the businesses haven't recovered? That doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense. There's a little disconnect between the local area unemployment statistics, the labor force statistics, and the job numbers in local businesses. I trust the job numbers in local businesses way more than this because we benchmark that to tax records every 3 months. So it gets benchmarked quickly. We benchmark this annually, and there's a little more volatility in the estimates here. But what we're seeing, at least nationally and at the statewide numbers, is there was a big surge in folks becoming self-employed. So they weren't employed in a payroll establishment. They were doing self-employed work, which entrepreneurship is one way people talked about it. I'm sure some of it was that. Who knows? This is a bit of a question mark here. I think what we're going to see is a lot of those self-employed people are going to go back to payroll jobs. It's really hard to start your own business. We love to see entrepreneurship. That's a great trend generally. But at the same time, I think what we're going to see is a lot of these 1.3 million There was a chunk of them who switched over to self-employed. They're gonna become part of the labor force that will be available, or the labor supply that a local business could hire relatively soon here, especially based on the wage trends that we'll look at in a second. But at the end of the day, I sort of trust this number more than I trust that number. But they're not completely contradictory to one another, especially if you look at the self-employed numbers. So to get to the struggle that we're dealing with here, though, so we just saw we're not recovered. We just saw that there are more unemployed workers in our local market. So if we aren't recovered and businesses are trying to hire, and we have more unemployed workers, it shouldn't be hard to find workers, right? Theoretically. This is where the struggle is, and we're all like, this doesn't make any sense. It kind of makes sense for 3 reasons. And we'll go through the 3 reasons why it's hard for businesses to find workers at a time when we have roughly 12,000, what was the number difference? 12,000-ish more unemployed workers today. Number 1 is the demand. So with labor demand, with the labor market conditions, there are 2 sides to the coin. There is the number of workers that are in the labor market, the supply of workers, and there is the demand for those workers at any given time, okay? That's simple supply and demand. What we're seeing is on the demand side of the equation, things are off the charts, like off the charts. This chart here we're looking at is job ads in the Portland metro area, okay? We had what I would call a full leveling up in labor demand that we've never seen before in the metropolitan area. Job ads right now, on 12-month moving average as of January, were roughly 50% higher than what they were before the pandemic began. 50% more job ads in the local market. Businesses are that red hot as far as hiring. To put that into perspective, on any given month, there's nearly 27,000 more job ads than before the pandemic. That's a lot of hiring. And that's one of the factors that's really making it hard to find workers is, sure, we have 12,000 more unemployed workers, but we have 50% more job ads. Businesses are hiring red hot right now. A lot of that has to do with spending and excess savings. We've seen this nationally where the savings rate went really high during the pandemic. We also saw stimulus dollars, that people had extra cash in their pockets. They weren't spending money in the normal ways. All of a sudden, people got pretty excited about extra cash just sitting there burning a hole in their pocket. So we saw a lot of spending on goods, and that excess spending on goods actually led to some of the inflation talk we'll have in a second here. But it also it meant that was a demand for the products that people produce, which meant that businesses had to hire more workers in order to meet the demand for the excess spending that was happening with all that savings that people had. So that's sort of working its way through, and we actually see the savings rate has got back down to normal rates, and personal consumption is back to normal levels again. So I don't think we're going to have that superheated surge anymore, but that's one of the reasons why we've seen the high number of high number of job ads, the labor demand. Now, on the other side of the equation, though, another reason why we're seeing a difficult time finding workers that also feeds into this job ads thing is the great reshuffle. You may have actually heard on the news people talk about the great resignation. Have you heard that term before? Okay, don't buy the great resignation concept. Whether or not they explain it well or not, I think the concept behind great resignation is these people are quitting and they're just living in mom's basement or something, right? Is that how you read it too? Like they're just leaving the labor market and they're just out. They're playing video games, or I don't know what they think they're doing, but they're just quitting. They are quitting, but they're quitting for other jobs. The reemployment rate is the highest it's ever been for quits. So these folks are quitting a job and finding a better job. And we'll get to the wage thing in a second here, we'll see it. But the quit rate in Oregon is the highest we've ever seen it before. A really high rate. On my notes, I have the exact number of how many quits we're seeing. I want to give you the real number because it's pretty phenomenal. It is, okay. So we've averaged 56,000 quits a month on average in the fourth quarter of 2021 in the state of Oregon. 56,000 a month on average. That's a lot of quits. Like I said, believe the quit rate number if you want, but that number, just to put the raw perspective on that, it's a big deal. And that's making it, what happens when someone quits a job? It creates a hole, right? Someone has to fill the hole. That creates, backwards, one of these. So if you quit a job, you create a labor demand to fill the hole, and they have to find that. What else do we know about quits? Replacing workers. It's really expensive, right? You lose someone who's good at their job, probably, hopefully, and then you got to train someone to be good at that job. And so it costs money to hire, it takes time, you lose productivity. It is a very costly process in the economy when you see high rates of quits. So this is damaging to businesses. Now, from a worker's perspective, this is actually a good thing. It sort of shows that they have leverage in the market. These are opportunities as a worker to sort of, as an old cohort of mine used to say, make hay while the sun shines. I'm sure you've heard that before, right? We often think that your career wages look linear. Through time, you just get older and you make more money, and it's all gravy. Wages don't look like that for most careers when you look at them. They look like a staircase, I should say. And there are those moments in the labor market where we see a step up in wages because of labor market conditions are such that there's more value to workers, so they make that step up. And then there might be a period, Great Recession, cough, cough, where you actually see labor demand so muted for such a long period of time, nobody sees real wage gains for a period. We just took a huge step up. Right, a big step. And you sort of want workers to take advantage of that when they have those opportunities, because there might not be another step for another decade, where we see conditions quite like this. So who you are in the labor market today makes a big difference of what your perception of this trend that we're seeing. But no doubt about it, if you're a business trying to hire, this is just a costly trend that we're seeing here. But think of it as the great reshuffle, not the great resignation. They're not resigning the labor market, they're reshuffling into other jobs and finding some better career paths, something with better hours, something with better pay. And societally, I think we'd probably think that that's an okay thing. We all sort of individually would want to have better opportunities as we get older and move through our careers. There's just a lot of that happening simultaneously right now. And then number 3, why it's hard to find workers in this labor market in a time when the supply is a little bit higher, is there's weird effects going on still. Some other less graphical ones that I can show. The retirements that we knew were going to happen, I'm going to get into retirements a little bit more at the end. Retiring boomers we knew were going to be a part of this equation before the pandemic was even on our radar. There's just a sheer demographic numbers issue with a huge cohort of workers who are going to be hitting prime retirement age right about now. So we knew that was going to be happening. And actually the data was showing retirements were accelerating beyond what we had expected. And so one of the things suppressing labor supply was those boomers retiring out of the labor market, which was always a concern. Like I said, something that we knew was going to happen. That was the inevitable. And we just hoped technology or something would help us. And what else do we know about retiring workers? They're at the end of their career, which means they're very skilled, very knowledgeable. So it's hard to replace them. These are, folks that are the hardest to replace. And also, when you retire, you become someone who you create a hole. You're no longer in the labor market. Someone needs to fill that hole. And you create more demand for goods and services because you disproportionately spend money compared to other demographics. Spend money on health services, spend money on goods, and particularly in other just general services. You go on vacations, you go on, take the grandkids to Silverwood, whatever it might be. If you haven't gone to Silverwood in a long time, it still holds up. So go to Silverwood, Coeur d'Alene. So retiring boomers, that was something we thought was, something we were worried about. And the data was showing us that this was a piece that was happening in the pandemic. And yet, the most recent data is telling us that there's the trend, or the term that people are using it now, is an unretirement trend. We're actually seeing the number of retirements actually slowing down, and some folks are re-entering the labor market. Now, this is probably not a long-term one. Eventually, we all have to retire, unfortunately. And so I'm not entirely sure what's causing this reversal of the trend. My mom might be a good example. She was a public school teacher in the Beaverton School District for 35 years or whatever it was. She retired and became a substitute just to, stay busy, make a little extra cash on the side. So she technically was in the labor market. COVID hits. Schools are remote. She didn't feel comfortable being around little kids when she's a 70-year-old lady. So she was like, yeah, I'm gonna be done with this. But then this school year, she's like, I feel comfortable being back in the classroom again. She goes back and she's subbing again. Okay, well that explains some of the subbing crisis school districts have had, is all these retired teachers who, weren't subbing for a while. So she's an unretirement. I don't know how common her story is, but that might explain the type of thing that we're seeing here, where some people just pulled out of maybe the side job that they had in their sort of retirement years, and they're coming back to that. Another piece is that, I don't know if you've seen what the stock market's done in the last 6 months. hasn't been very good. And if you rely on stock returns, then you might be a little nervous about sort of retiring right now. And so some folks might have just decided to, delay retirement a little bit until we see market conditions are a little bit more favorable. So they're kind of a wild card. We don't know what the heck's going on with retirees. Moral of the story. That was like a 5-minute tangent on I have no idea. But the pandemic impacts were very real still, too. We've heard lots of stories about folks struggling with childcare issues for working parents, being able to, folks who have pre-existing conditions, who are vulnerable to COVID, all sorts of transportation, whatever it might be. There's just lingering issues, and this is becoming an increasingly smaller number of the people who might be being sort of suppressing our labor supply, but it still exists today, and hopefully that becomes like minuscule in the next few months if we continue in the trend we're going. Knock on wood. Okay. No longer I'm going to be saying anything like, now that COVID's gone, I think we've learned our lesson. Don't say that anymore. You're going to jinx it. So anyways, those lingering concerns are still there. But you put it all together, and this is my favorite way to represent what the labor market looks like what the labor market conditions are. And it is the ratio of the number of unemployed workers who are in your labor market relative to the number of job ads that are out there. So, for some context, back in February of 2020, before the pandemic began, when we all lived a glorious life of not worrying about the friend next to you coughing, there were 0.8 unemployed workers for every job ad. So we had less than one unemployed worker per job ad in the Portland metro area before the pandemic. Holy cow, that's a tight labor market. This is before the pandemic. Okay, that means if you were a business who was hiring, on average, you had less than one unemployed person who would apply for your job. Yikes, that's bad. The pandemic made things look a lot better. The ratio totally flipped. The combination of less demand for workers during the middle of the pandemic and all those unemployed people that we just saw a second ago made the ratio, 2.5 unemployed workers per job ad. But look where we are today. This is a 12-month moving average, which means the actual number, the monthly number, there's enough volatility here. I didn't want to show the straight month number, is below what it was before the pandemic. So we're back to that less than one unemployed worker per job ad that's out there. This is a very, very tight labor market, like excessively tight labor market, and one that isn't completely foreign to us. But it does feel a little different. So even though the ratio would tell us the labor market's just as tight as it was before the pandemic, businesses are saying to us, it's actually even tighter. We have a job vacancy survey that we send out every quarter to businesses across the state. As of 2021, so that the annual numbers were on average 72% of all job ads, job vacancies that were out there were identified as difficult to fill by Oregon businesses. The number in the Portland metro area was a little bit lower at 64%. The Portland metro area always has less difficult to fill, and there's a big reason why. It's because y'all are big. You have a very large labor market, and so you can pull workers from even outside the Portland metro area. It turns out people commute from Salem to Portland. Yikes. I would not do that, but people do. Like you can just pull, get someone from Hood River, whatever it is. There's enough weight here behind it that local businesses don't struggle nearly as much as the statewide average. But needless to say, what was the number before, back in 2019, before the pandemic? We were sitting at 57% that were difficult to fill, even though the ratio looked pretty much the same. So it is a harder experience today, and at the end of the day, I think it's the difference between these two numbers here, even though that the ratio of unemployed per job ad is nearly identical. I think it's that quit piece. It's the number of folks who are quitting and finding new opportunities, leaving the hole behind them, and that constant churn is just terrible to have to deal with. It's just so expensive, so costly, so time-consuming. So your HR managers at your offices and stuff, give them a little pat on the back and say, we're here for you. We support you. They got a hard job these days. So you all are telling us that it's hard to find workers. So in a tight labor market like this, it's, what happens? What are the typical things we see? Like I said, this is common, that an opportunity for workers when it's costly to businesses. It's literally costly to businesses because to compete for the increasingly few great workers who are left in the market who don't have a great job already, you got to offer higher wages in order to get them. And we're looking here at wage increases, and I have we'll get into some of the nominal versus real wage increases. This gets real sexy when we start talking about inflation here in a second. But you could see over the last few years, this is for Oregon, the inflation, the real number, the orange one, which is inflation-adjusted wage increases year over year. We dabbled between 1.5%–2% annually, which that's on top of inflation. So we were seeing real tangible increases to our spending power as Oregon workers. But that's sort of what the average was. I cut out these the pandemic years here. There are some real crazy composition issues when we're talking about wages. So anyone who's showing you changes from what wages looked like from 2020 to 2021, don't believe any of the data. Not that the data is bad, but the composition issue of who was in the labor market, who was out of it. Think about it this way. Who lost the jobs disproportionately during the pandemic? Restaurant workers, hotel workers. Do they make a ton of money? They do not make a ton of money. So what happens, all the average wages is all the payroll divided by the number of workers, or number of jobs, okay? If you cut out their relatively low pay, but their relatively large number of jobs they represent, it makes the average wage, you lose all these workers, low-wage workers, it makes the average wage go up. That's not real. That's not actually what's happening in the labor market. That's literally just cutting out low-wage workers out of the market. So then what happens when we start adding those restaurant workers back into the labor market? Oh, we get a bunch of slightly higher wage, but still low wage relatively workers coming back in. And what happens is it makes the average wage go down again. So that's what I'm saying about there's composition issues with those wage numbers for those pandemic years. I think we're now far enough removed from it that we could start to analyze the data again. So let's go all the way to Q3 2021 here, and you can see from a nominal perspective, non-inflation adjusted perspective, the average wage jumped 10.4% in Oregon from what it was a year prior. 10.4%. That is pretty nutty. And exciting if you're a worker. It sucks if you're a business trying to pay for that. But less exciting for workers is look what the real take-home difference was. 4.8%. Now that's double than what we saw from a real perspective, the inflation adjusted perspective. But that's still not nearly as glamorous as that 10.1% because inflation is taking a bite out of the purchasing power of workers' extra pay they're seeing today in a noticeable and real way. So it's sort of tough for businesses, and also workers aren't sort of reaping the full benefit that they could because of the inflation that we've been talking about. So let's get on inflation for a while, okay? This is the exciting part. No, I'm kidding. Less exciting. Nobody likes this. How bad is it today? If we're looking at year-over-year perspective, 7.3%. The average cost of goods and services is up across the nation. We haven't seen anything like that. I've never seen anything like that in my lifetime spending money. In my life, I think it's happened, but not. I was a young baby and I wasn't spending money. But in the modern era, we haven't seen inflation anything like this. Sorry if someone's older and you're like, it was modern in 1977. It was. But you know, most of us. Sorry, too soon. I'm not around millennials anymore. So that's a lot. And like I said, we've gotten into sort of a crazy pattern where the Federal Reserve's benchmark inflation that they shoot for, like their goal, and some level of inflation is actually really healthy and good for an economy. So we don't want to see 0%. That's not good. The benchmark's about 2%. And we were dang near pretty consistently right on that benchmark for a lot of years. And so we were kind of spoiled. We were sort of in a lull of thinking that this was just a thing of the past. So that's a big switch. And what is it exactly that's causing inflation to go up today? Not a lot of things that you're surprised about, probably. The news is really good at talking about used cars, how much you can make money off your used car, which, we always used to joke as economists, there's depreciating resources and appreciating resources, and never buy a car thinking you're going to see an appreciation. Well, unprecedented again. It turns out you can make money selling your used car. So transportation is where you see one of the biggest ones there. Energy, obviously, is a big one. We've all heard about oil and gas prices and the effect that has on the economy. Big swings there. Ironically, talking about how year over year can be misleading. For a while there, oil was a funny one, though, because I don't know if you remember, was it spring, early summer of 2020, what happened to oil prices then? Does anyone remember? They were trying to give oil away. It went negative. I didn't even know it could do that. Somehow oil prices went negative. They were literally take my oil and store it somewhere because I can't deal with this. So year over year there for a while was really inflated because it was going from like negative to like $100 a barrel, and you're like, well, that's a big percentage increase, it turns out. So once again, with some of the weirdness of the pandemic, you got to be careful with the over-the-year changes. But we're far enough removed from some of the initial shocks that we can look at it. You go down the list, though, it really is isolated to a few areas of our economy where it's really bad right now. And I'm not kidding. I mean, it is really bad. That transportation, energy, fuel, etc. Food and beverage a little bit. So if you've gone back to a restaurant, let's say you took some time off restaurants during the pandemic, you might notice you're spending a little bit more money than you were before. Definitely noticeable. But you get down to the bottom here, shelter's a funny one. It's one of the lower ones. And I think we're going to talk about housing in a second here. But I think everyone's perception is that shelter would be at the very top, right? That's the one driving inflation. We'll get to why that's not the case in a second. Most of us have locked in our housing prices, thank goodness. But for those who are first-time home buyers, may God bless your soul. Then we have at the bottom here, this is a funny one. Usually, back in our world of 2% benchmark, where we're hitting this, the things that we were complaining about that were exceeding inflation were always medical costs that were running away and tuition, education expenses. And ironically, in today's economy, they're the lowest ones contributing to inflation today. So we are in bizarro world to an extreme. Hopefully that stays consistent for higher ed. They're struggling right now with enrollments. The bread and butter for state universities, especially in Oregon, to sort of make up some of the funding gap has been to pull in international students. They make a lot more money off those international students. We basically stopped having any of those folks. So universities are definitely struggling today, and it's the benefit of students that we're not seeing the huge enrollment increases, or not, tuition increases that we were accustomed to. So like I said, we're in the bizarro world a little bit here. So why is inflation so bad? There's a few reasons that we can talk about, like what's causing inflation to be the way that it is. I don't have all the answers by any means. Sorry, I don't have all of them. No, I got a few though, okay? One of them is an economic concept that you may or may not have heard before. It's called the wage price spiral, and it's like the death spiral. That's the sexier term to call it, I think. We're seeing the first part here. So the wage price spiral begins with one component, which is for some reason you see increased wages or incomes, okay? Often that's because of a tight labor market. So we know this happened. We just looked at the wage data, right? We just saw a huge step up in people's amount of money that they were making. We also know that as far as incomes go, the stimulus played a factor in this as well. So people made more money, had more money in their pockets. They spent less during early in the pandemic, so they're going to start spending it. So what do? The demand for goods and services rises dramatically because you got more money in your pocket. So you start spending money like crazy. And for us, in our world, it was goods, not services. We're starting to see some transition back to service spending. So they spend a bunch of money of this disposable income. So the spiral begins. So what happens now when all this cash gets poured into businesses? Well, they got to do something, right? The price for those goods starts to rise because they're running out of goods to sell. So you have less and less goods and more demand for them, supply demand, you got to charge more for it. So you start raising the price of your goods. Well, if the price of your goods starts getting higher, then your workers say, shoot, I go to the grocery store and I'm losing like 10% of my paycheck to the grocery store because we've seen all this inflation there. You need to pay me more money to be doing the work that you're having me do. So they demand more from their business. So then the business says, yeah, you're right, I don't want to lose you because then I'd have to replace you. We just talked about how costly that is. So then they pay them more money. So when they pay them more money, the higher wages then just get turned back into higher production costs again. The wage price spiral, the death spiral, if you will, I think we're in it a little bit right now, for sure. I mean, we've hit like the first three lines, kind of into the fourth line to a T, like exactly how the theory would say. How do we get out of the spiral? Good luck with that. I don't have good answers for getting out of the spiral. The Federal Reserve killing demand through higher cost of borrowing is going to be one way to do it, I think. But it's a scary trend because there's not great answers. Economic theory is great at telling us how it happens. It's not great at telling us how to get out of it. And so TBD there. But this is one of the reasons why we're seeing inflation, and it will probably continue. There's a few other big reasons why we're seeing inflation as well, though. And a lot of those have to revolve around the supply constraints and bottlenecks. And those have been well publicized for most of the pandemic. There is the class of economists who have been the transitory economist. A lot of folks were like, yeah, inflation's happening, but it's transitory. Have you heard that term before? In my world, there's like two spheres. This is permanent and this is transitory. And there's like a battle that exists amongst economists, which one it is. I don't think it's that simple. I don't think it's an either or. I think it's a little bit of both. I think we're seeing the wage price spiral, and I think we are seeing transitory effects as well. Transitory meaning this isn't permanent. This is a transitionary period because we're struggling with being able to get goods to market. Transportation is hard. We can't unload cargo ships from the port of Long Island. Like those were well-documented, real concerns that were happening, which made it so that the supply of goods was muted, and so the prices went up. And certain goods in particular, the microchips have been well talked about. Also the help wanted. So like the shortage of workers is feeding into this as well. And once again, I think that some of the supply constraints as far as labor are going to ease as we move into the next few months here as well, once we see the pandemic concerns ease. The upper right I threw on here, this is just a picture of some factory in China. I threw it on there to remind us. I don't know, has anyone paid attention to what's going on in China right now? Anyone seen the COVID stuff? They're going like full lockdown in like some of these biggest manufacturing regions in China. That is going to get passed to us. Talk about the transitory bottlenecks and supply chain issues. They supply a lot of the goods that we use, intermediate goods that we use in our local manufacturing, or even some finished goods that we buy and consume. So that's just one more thing that's going to take a while to work itself out of the economy is China going full lockdown right now. So, who knows? We're not through this yet. So the transitory people aren't fully wrong yet because there's still transitory things that keep happening, and it's definitely a factor. And then the last reason why I want to focus on why inflation is happening is us, our expectations. We only buy goods that we either want to buy or kind of have to buy, right? If I go to a restaurant, actually recently I went to a new winery that opened, tasting room in Bend, downtown. Walked in, it was some fancy French winery thing. I like wine, I like good wine, but I walked in, we sat down, and it was $40 for a tasting. There were 4 tasting glasses. And we know that there's a wine pour, we're all familiar with wine here, you guys live in the Willamette Valley, and then there's a tasting pour. $40 for 4 tasting pours. And I was like, ugh. I walked out. My willingness to pay was not that high. I don't care. I'm like, that's not good value. I'm an economist. I'm all about value, and that was not it, right? And no, I'm not even going to badmouth the winery, although they're a French one. They're not an Oregon one, so we could badmouth them a little bit. So drink the Oregon Pinots. But if we have a certain expectation that goods and services are going to be higher, our willingness to pay is going to be higher too, right? If someone tells me you see 7.3% is what inflation's been, then you're going to go to the grocery store today and be like, dang it, man, it costs more for my stuff today, but Damon said it was going to cost more, so I got to do what I got to do, But there's a certain point where we no longer think that that's true. Like we're like, I'm just not going to pay that much for that thing anymore. And we have expectations. This is consumer expectations for inflation that the New York Federal Reserve does. And I think it's fascinating that our expectations as a country is 6% over the next year. So that means that businesses could know in the back of their mind that consumers expect 6%, which means they're not going to be too panicked if you do increase your goods or service prices a little bit, because their expectation is that that's going to happen anyways. So there's a little bit of a mental game with inflation that happens too. Like, how much can I pass on to a consumer that they're still willing to go? Now, $40 for those 4 tastings, sorry, you lost me there. But if they had done 32 instead, I probably would have stayed. So you know what I'm saying? There's a certain happy medium there. And I don't think businesses make decisions based on this consumer expectation of inflation. But that mental game of how we all make our personal decisions adds up to macro trends. And it doesn't bode well that inflation is going away, because we still think inflation is going to be here, right? So housing, I'll do a little side tangent on housing here, sorry. Housing, we saw, was not one of the bigger contributors to inflation nationally. which the housing crisis that we're in right now is a national one. This is, it's well documented how hard it is to find housing and affordable housing in the Portland metro area. In Bend, holy cow, good luck. Bend ran away from, we used to be pretty close to the Portland prices. We're 20% higher than Portland now in Bend. So good luck. It used to be a point where people could sell their Portland house and then get a good deal at a Bend house. We're landing closer to LA now, and that's not a good thing. That's a real bad thing in the long term. But anyways, well documented the struggles across Oregon and across the nation we've had with housing. And this is just the Zillow numbers. And so if there's any real estate agents in the crowd, I'm sorry I didn't just do your guys' hottest numbers off the press. But Zillow does a pretty good job on aggregate talking about how home valuation. And big step up, whatever the number is, if it's, the Portland Metro, I think the formal number from Zillow was like 12% over the last year, prices went up. It was, in the last 2 years, over 30% in Bend. Just, bonkers numbers. And that is, like I said, not being translated into the informal inflation numbers because many people who were already homeowners had locked in interest rates at low rates, and they had their mortgage locked in with, we have some state representatives in here. How much can our property taxes increase every month or every year? Is it 3%? 3%, yes. So, we've got locked in sort of how much our actual housing costs can increase for most of us who are already homeowners. But like I said, this is a tough time if you're a first-time home buyer. And let's look at an example to talk about. The example is the next slide. Sorry. So housing costs, or the affordability conundrum, consumers and the media focus on this. They focus on actual, how much home prices cost. But there's a lot to affordability than it's not just the home price. There's two other variables. There's incomes or wages, which we've talked about. We saw great numbers there. We've seen real increases, 4.8% over the last year, even after adjusting for inflation. Home prices are going up, so they're both going up. But the sort of the nail in the coffin here that's really hurting first-time homebuyers today is the interest rate hike. So the cost of borrowing is the third factor in affordability. And we were just talking, did I hear, so 5%, what you got quoted. Over the last week, it went over 4.5% for a 30-year fixed-rate mortgage. I refinanced twice in the pandemic to just keep going lower. I think we eventually bottomed out at 2.65 is what we hit on our 30-year fixed-rate mortgage. We bought down the rate a little bit because I'm just maximize the lowest payment possible. I'm an economist, if you didn't know. But super low rates. We're 5% now. That is a huge swing. Do you know what 1 percentage point swing in the 30-year fixed-rate mortgage is for home price? It's rough 10%. I told you that, yeah. It's roughly 10%. Every point it goes up is 10% less house you can afford. And vice versa. Every point it goes down is 10% more house you can buy. And so what we're seeing now is home prices are going up, wages are going up, and interest rates are all going up, all at the same time. And so when we put all of these together, what does that actually look like for affordability? Let's do some math together, all right? I don't know if you guys knew you signed up for math. This is what happens when we get in person. Okay, so we got a column here on the left, 2021. So these are fake examples, but let's just, for the sake of argument, walk through some of them because we're going to get sort of real examples. Fake example, but real changes, we'll say. So household income. Let's say your household makes $120,000 a year. That's not bad, right? Okay, that's higher than the average. You're doing okay. Make some money. In the last year, you got that 4.8% real wage increase or income increase that we just talked about. So that's a real number. So now you make 125 and some change, nearly 126,000 for your household. Once again, pretty good. We would hope that a household that makes $126,000 a year can afford a house. So then let's go down to the next line item, the home purchase price. Let's say you were shooting for a $500,000 house. Well, with the increases we've seen, let's be conservative here. Let's say 10% increase in home prices. We know it's been more than that, right? But let's be conservative here, 10%. So now your home purchase price is $550,000, okay? That sucks, but you gotta do what you gotta do. The down payment, let's say you had saved $50,000. Congratulations, that's hard to do. You didn't make it any bigger during the pandemic, so let's say that just stayed the same, okay? And then finally, the last line item here, your interest rates went from 2.75% to 4.1%, 4.41%. But maybe it's 5%. We're being conservative here with these numbers, right? Because we know the home price growth is more than that, and now interest rates are at 5%. We do the math. Your monthly payment for that mortgage last year, $2,300 a month. Okay, reasonable. And honestly, if you're looking at rents and for even apartments, I just talked to my brother who lives in kind of near Hillsborough, between Hillsborough and Portland, off 26. Anyways, his apartment, which is a nice-ish two-bedroom apartment, it was like $1,600 a month. So I was, that stinks. So it's not. We could say that's somewhat affordable. But just for the variables that we've seen happen shift over the last year, we jumped that mortgage up to nearly $3,000. So a $700 a month swing in what it would cost to buy that house. That's a 30% increase in your monthly bill. In the context of pretty good trends, except for, the two are bad. I mean, it's the 10%, which is conservative, and the interest rate thing. That cost of borrowing is huge. Moral of the story is interest rates are dramatically impacting affordability right now, especially for the buyers. And we're not even going to talk about renters here, but the rental market is pretty atrocious as well. Okay, so we're going to transition to the conclusion here. I'm sure am I over time? I have no idea where we're at, but we'll give some expectations. Here's my crystal ball for 2022. Number one, don't expect this labor crunch to go anywhere. It's still going to be a tight labor market. And there's a few reasons why I think that's going to be the case. Number one, how do you increase the supply of your labor force? The big one is get people to move here, right? More people, more in-migration, more people come into the area. What have we seen in the pandemic? Portland's population has stagnated. We have not seen hardly any growth in population over the last 2 years compared to what we were accustomed to. So we're not seeing more people move here, which is one of the answers for how we get more workers to apply for jobs, is literally more working families moving here. That's not happening, and hopefully we see a bit of a switch there. But what is the ceiling on population growth? Housing. You can only have as many people move someplace as you have housing units available, or housing units that the people who are moving there can afford to live in. So this is a real ceiling, and for Portland, it's actually less of a concern. Someplace like Bend is like crisis level 20, it's a lot of lower wage workers, and there is just absolutely no housing that someone could live with the wages that are offered in those businesses. So not as bad here, but it's definitely a factor. Another way that we could increase our labor supply, young workers. That's this cute McDonald's cup girl here, okay? Young workers for decades had been dropping out of the labor market. Why? For good reasons. We saw a big push towards higher education, people moving into, focusing on extracurriculars that benefited college enrollment applications and whatever. But you know what happens when you see McDonald's offering wages at $15 an hour, $17 an hour, $2,000 signing bonus? Those kids start like, band practice could wait because I'm going to do that. So we've actually seen some pretty cool trends where we're seeing workers come back into the labor market in a reversal of a 20-year trend of this declining. So this is sort of an area where we have opportunity to pull more workers in, is those young people. Right now we're sitting with the lowest unemployment rate for young workers we've ever seen on record, which is great news, yes. But more opportunity, I think, to do more of that. The top here, though, how do we address some of the labor crisis? We just saw this. The extra supply of workers we have is pretty muted. The issue is our demand is that 50% higher than what it was before the pandemic. So you never want to hear an economist saying this. This is like, controversial. No one in the media is here, right? We could lower demand. That is going to solve some of the problem, getting us to equilibrium. People spending less money, unfortunately, is one of the ways we likely are going to get the equilibrium. And we'll get into in a second here why I think that's going to happen and why I think it's not necessarily a crisis level issue for us to spend less money and for demand to go down. It was so superheated, it was unsustainable, and it drove us into the inflation issues, it drove us into the labor issues. So dropping demand a little bit, seeing the demand for your goods and services that you all produce come down a wee bit isn't the worst thing in the world. But normally that's like a terrifying thing. You're like, less people buying my stuff? That's not good. But I think that might be one of our opportunities as we move forward to sort of get us out of this sort of crazy cycle we're in. The retirements are still baked into the equation. Regardless of the fact that we've seen this unretirement trend, we know it's happening. So we got to just keep an eye on it. That's going to be something that's baked into our labor crisis narrative here for the next 5 or 6 years. We're going to have some struggles there. And then finally, inflation, I think, is going to cool. We're not going to be at 7.3% at the end of this year. We're going to be lower than that. Whatever the number is going to be, I don't know. I would put my money on like 4.5%, 5% maybe. But there's a couple of reasons why it's going to cool. You're already seeing at the top here, personal consumption expenditures has started to tail off. We flattened out. People aren't spending as much as they were before. That's this demand side here where I was talking about people spend less money. It's already happening. And then the bottom here is just the representation of borrowing costs, the interest rate going up. If it costs more to borrow, people spend less money. So the combination of those two should lead us to less demand for goods and services, which means we'll have less demand pinch points, and inflation should ease a little bit. So, whew, guys, we did it. We got through the slide deck. Whew. Are there any questions? Did I go way over time there? I had no clock or anything.
You're good. You're
okay.
good. No, but a lot of information there. I think we were able to keep up with you.
Okay, good. Woo.
But there was a lot to digest, without a doubt. But so does everybody feel good now? They've got all the answers?
All the answers,
How to
yes.
deal with the rising energy costs and the higher food costs?
Yeah.
Good job.
Yeah, thank you.
Good job.
You have all the answers, yeah. Hopefully you all locked in that 2.75% interest rate when you had the opportunity.
Well, and I'm the one that actually found that out the hard way. I talked to my bank yesterday when I originally was talking to them a year ago. It was under 3%, and they quoted me yesterday 5%. And he said it's probably going to be 5.25% next week and probably 5.5% by sometime in April. The 10-year yield has jumped so much in the last few weeks, and they based a 30-year conforming loan rate off the 10-year yield. I think it went up a half point yesterday and today. So anyway, they're telling me to get over here so I can get in the camera with you.
There you're in it now.
There we go.
Yeah, look at that. Hi, Pete.
Okay, let's start out with some questions here for Damon. Are there particular industries that seem to attract people into the labor force?
Yeah, obviously young people come into certain industries. So leisure and hospitality is the big one, the area that's been struggling the most, the area that benefits the most from young workers coming back into the labor market because of the higher wages. So restaurants, hotels, other sorts of leisure, recreation. Those are always like entry-level jobs. Not to say people don't have careers in them. They do, but that's one of the entry points there. We've tracked what's been sort of interesting. It's a little big brothery, so beware. I'm not trying to criticize, we know things about you. We have wage records for every worker in Oregon, Social Security number-based wage records. So I isolated every worker who was a leisure and hospitality worker who lost their job during the pandemic, and we tracked them through time to see where they showed up. We also have unemployment insurance claim data, so we matched it to the SSNs. And to say, what happened to all these workers? What's going on with them? And what we found was that as we moved through time, even as businesses started reopening and rehiring, a lot of workers started dropping off unemployment, but where were they going? Not back to leisure and hospitality. We saw a ton of workers transition to other industries, and so one of the reasons why it's a big pinch point for that industry in particular, they lost that workforce, and that workforce is not unemployed today. They're happily employed in another industry, a lot of them construction, by the way, and that left a huge hole behind, and so they're trying to fill that. So yeah, it's really interesting to see these dynamics that have shifted through time during the pandemic, and it tends to always be that the lower wage businesses sort of get the short end of the stick. And I feel terrible for restaurants in the last 2 years, because I often say, they were an innocent bystander in this pandemic. Restaurants didn't have a bad business model or were doing anything wrong. It was just they're the ones that got shut down the hardest and affected the most, which then it's been a really difficult recovery for them.
Do you think Oregon, being a big tourism state, now that the mask mandate's been taken off, Will we rebound faster than some other states because of the natural features that we have here?
Yeah, so Bend is the great example in this one. So like we saw the Bend trend, we're way down, lost 1 in 5 jobs, we're up 3% now. Bend benefited from the natural, so there was a perception and a reality that, recreating outside is way safer than recreating inside. So although Vegas might say otherwise, they've done okay recently here. But Bend had a perception of like, yeah, we could go hiking or skiing or whatever, and it's a safe activity. So we actually saw visitation last year in Central Oregon broke records. Never seen as many visitors as we did last year. And part of that was people didn't feel comfortable going in airplanes. So they were like, I don't mind driving. And it's a regional drive market. People from San Francisco, it's only 7 hours. People from Seattle, it's only 7 hours. People from Portland, it's 3. And so they benefited from the outdoor and the drive market thing. Now, Portland is a different a different beast a little bit, right? What is the visitation we rely on here more locally? It's much more focused on having conferences, business travel, sort of less tourists who are recreating in the city. And so we want to see some of that normal business travel come back up. We want to see some of the conferences back up, public speaking engagements come back, and that will make me feel better about Portland more broadly. But a lot of the smaller metros that are recreation and outdoor based have done really well in the recovery, for sure.
Yeah, and I think that trend will continue.
Yeah.
Substantially going into the warmer weather months that we have now.
Yeah, we're kind of hoping that we don't break another record visitation in the Central Oregon area. It was sort of, I think we hit a capacity, so maybe that's enough there.
Okay, does the OED,
Oregon Employment Department, that's my agency, yes,
have services to help employees improve their recruiting for hard to hire jobs? And then I'm going to dovetail into another question. And can you define what being unemployed is?
Yes, good question. So the first one, as far as services, the Employment Department has multiple arms or silos of the agency. I'm in this tiny little silo of Economist that we're like in our own little world. But there are real, tangible services to you all besides just numbers folks like me. And so there is the WorkSource Oregon. You maybe have heard of that before. They have services to help businesses recruit workers. They also have every unemployed person who is on an unemployment insurance claim has to file with WorkSource to be part of the pool of workers that they have to tap to help when the recruiting side. So they are definitely a service, and I'd reach out to the folks in WorkSource Oregon City. I'm 99% sure there's an office in Oregon City. So yeah, thank you. You all know better than I do. Sorry. We have them in almost every city, so I was like, I think we have one here. As far as unemployed, there's 2 ways to define unemployed. It's really popular for people to think that when we talk about unemployed, we're just talking about people on unemployment insurance. And that is not the case. Statistically, to be unemployed, you are just someone who is not actively working and somebody who is actively seeking work. That's it, statistically. So the number of unemployed statistically is much larger, and that's what we are focusing on here, is much larger than the number of unemployment insurance claims. Because like I said, we were a few thousand more than before the pandemic as far as statistical unemployed. The number on unemployment insurance claims today, well below what it was before the pandemic. We have fewer people on unemployment insurance today than before the pandemic. So this sort of notion or perception that there's all these people milking benefits or whatever, nope, that's gone. None of that anymore. I mean, the extended benefits from the federal government expired in September, and already before then we were back to pre-pandemic levels of claim activity before the loss of those benefits. And since the loss, we dipped even further below pre-pandemic levels. So yeah, as far as hoping that all those people in unemployment insurance will be a miraculous help to this labor crunch, they're not the saving grace at this point. There's very few there left.
Okay, good. Are there clusters of companies in those industries that cities might try to attract to bolster household income within their metro areas? Clusters.
Yeah, good question. Every area has a competitive advantage. And it's important to not focus on one industry being the one that we should all focus on. It was really in vogue in the last 10 or 15 years, for people to talk about like healthcare clusters or I'm trying to think of the other big one that the workforce world was really focusing on. I think it's less asking the question of like, what's a good cluster, and asking what's the right cluster for us. Because every labor market has certain skills within the workforce that exist there, certain amenities, whether those be space, time, facilities, having a beautiful river next door, whatever it might be. And so really leaning into what those assets are. And so there's not like one that I'd be like, yeah, this is the one that every community should focus on, but like what's right for Oregon City and focus on what's right for Oregon City. And obviously a lot of that's professional business services because that's what metropolitan areas do. You guys do particularly well here as well. And also manufacturing to an important degree, but lesser than some of the professional stuff. So keep doing more of the manufacturing.
Well, I'm not ready to get into that yet, but that is our topic for next month.
Oh, okay, well.
Is manufacturing.
I just teed you guys up for that, yeah.
Which we will share with the group here in a moment. Are there successful strategies that smaller towns or bigger cities have pursued that attract entrepreneurial types to start businesses that eventually mature and thrive? And why do you feel Seattle has recovered so much more quickly than the Portland metro?
Yeah, so the Seattle one's easy. It's Amazon. It's almost fully Amazon is just the difference there. They were hiring aggressively, thousands and thousands of jobs, while other businesses were laying off jobs. So that meant that the total loss looked not as bad. So that's one of the reasons why their dip wasn't as bad, and also one of the reasons why their recovery is better. I guess we could say, well, we should have a strategy around making Amazon move here, but that has its own issues if you've seen communities that have struggled with Amazon. So we do have in Troutdale now a newish distribution center from Amazon, and there's one in Salem as well. So those numbers actually help the transportation side for Oregon quite a bit. The question was, so the Seattle one, why is that different? What was the other part of that? Yeah, sorry, I got that. I got you. So as far as entrepreneurship and getting people to sort of start and create businesses, one interesting trend that I think has been, we don't really know where this is going, and it's a great way to sort of end this conversation, is the remote workers. I mean, I just focused for the Portland downtown core how damaging losing those workers in the downtown core was for the city, and that how much it would be nice to get them back in there. What's also interesting, though, is the mobility that is created by workers having flexibility in that way. And what we know is these tend to be workers that are higher paid workers, higher skilled workers. They start businesses at higher rates than other workers. And what's happening is we're living in a world where these workers are sort of being shoved into places that they weren't before, whether that's smaller rural communities, or maybe someone decides that they're going to go live in Gladstone instead of living in, downtown Beaverton. Like they just want a little more space, whatever that is. Well, now some of these smaller communities are benefiting from the ingenuity and the benefits of those workers. Yes, they're not being paid by a business there locally, but they're still part of the labor market, the labor force that is a potential for a local business or the potential of someone who could create a new business. And I don't know if in the end this is going to be a good thing or a bad thing for us as a society, but it is a really interesting trend that we're seeing that I think is it's fearful for some big cities, but some smaller metro areas are really excited about the prospect of what does it look like if we're receiving the brain drain into our community and getting these great workers that are coming in. So that's just a TBD one. It's just interesting to see the psychology of the future of work and how much the remote's going to stick.
All right. We're just a couple more.
Okay.
You mentioned in the last quarter of 2021, 56,000 individuals entered into the Great Reshuffle.
Yeah.
Not the Great Resignation,
Yes,
but the
Great
Great
Reshuffle. Thank you. We're all going to change that, right? We're going to reshuffle.
Everybody good with cards? You good there? So last month we had a presentation on workforce development by Bridget Daisy, and one of the things that came out of that presentation was when the employer goes to fill that void of that individual resigning, they may not be looking for exactly the same skills that that person that left had, because technology and other types of changes are evolving what skills that employee needs to possess in order to fill the demands of today's job opportunities. Mm-hmm. Is Oregon ready for that? Are we prepared? Is the metro region prepared to be able to address that?
Yeah, you'll hear a lot of these folks talk about the skills gap is often, or the shifting demand of the types of skills that are required for jobs that are out there. What we see, and that's sort of like a long-term trajectory thing that, there's always a little bit of an unknown there. But what we see is the skill set of the local and statewide labor market has the skills that the businesses that are hiring are asking for. So there's not a mismatch there. It's not like the reason why we're struggling to find workers is we need a bunch of people who can do X, and we have a bunch of people, but they only do Y. Like we don't have that disconnect fully yet. So that's a good thing, like that I think for the most part our workforce is properly skilled. And our educational attainment, especially in the metro area here, is really high. There was the joke back in the day, all the bachelor's degree and master's degree baristas in downtown Portland, right? I'm sure you all remember those jokes back in the mid-2000s or whatever. Like, it is true though that our educational attainment is really high in the metro area. But ultimately, yeah, I'm not too concerned about a skills gap that actually exists today. If anything, what we're seeing is businesses have to reevaluate what it is they're looking for in a labor market that looks like this. Yes, you need to maybe look at your wages, but more than the wages is saying, maybe I always said, like, as a shortcut, you got to have a bachelor's degree and you need 10 years of experience for this job. In a market like today, maybe the answer is, do you really need the bachelor's degree? Is it that important? Or was it just a nice shortcut when we had a lot of applicants to cut the applicants out? In a market like today, maybe you limit the number of restrictions, and you might find the person who's perfect for your organization, who has the exact skills you're looking for, even though they don't have the bachelor's degree, or maybe they don't have 10 years of experience, they've only got 7 years of experience, and that's okay. And so changing, like, being able to sort of morph as the labor market changes to your expectations of how you recruit workers, I think is really important. And doing that relatively quickly. Because if you're not doing it, the other businesses that you're competing for the same workers are, and you're falling behind and finding it increasingly difficult to find those workers.
Challenging.
Challenging, yes.
To say the least. Well, I know most of your presentation today, Damon, was on microeconomics here in our metro region. I'm going to go big picture now to the 30,000-foot elevation. Internationally, with the conflict that's taking place between Ukraine and Russia and China and Europe, how do you see that having an impact here on our economy, in our state, and the metro region?
I think the biggest impact on these macro things, and I'm not a macroeconomist, and I try to avoid going too far out of my lane on this one, but what we've seen is this, whether it's the pandemic that was a global impact on our supply chains, or now we're seeing the impacts that a war in Europe might have, further disruptions to our supply chains, further disruptions to the way our economies are intertwined, which is just dollar bills. That's costs, more cost, less efficiency. So how much we directly feel the impact of the war with Russia and Ukraine, I don't want to say specifically, I have no idea, but I do know that just more little issues that are hicking up. The shutdowns that we're seeing in China are a great example, maybe that will impact us more. Although ironically, I don't know if you thought about this or heard this, but by China locking everyone down, sure, that creates bottlenecks for all of us, right? Have you seen what the consumption of oil and gas has happened when they did that? All of a sudden, there was a week and a half ago, prices went from $120 a barrel to $90 a barrel overnight when they announced the shutdown, the lockdown. So you're like, there's the yin and yang, or like some poles on the string that go both directions, and it's where it's going to land is anyone's guess. I'm not going to don't write any of my predictions down because I have no idea on that stuff. But it is interesting that you pull on one side of the lever and something crazy over here goes up or down, right? So who knows?
Don't you love economists? They have so much to say, but then in the end they go, but don't really count on what I'm saying to be the truth. Everything can change.
We just like the sound of our own voices.
A little disclaimer is always included as the finale. But anyway, thank you so much, Damon, for an amazing presentation. A lot of information there. And just like at our other forums, I'm sure if someone would like to have a copy of your PowerPoint deck, your slide deck, that we can make that available for you to be able to use at one of your other organizations for your membership to be able to view it. So thank you. Appreciate it.
Yes. It's a pleasure being here.
So as I mentioned just a few moments ago, next month our forum will be a panel presentation on the challenges facing small businesses and manufacturing specifically. I think, Sherry, you've lined up a great group of people to go ahead and participate in that panel. And I really think that it'll be very, very informative. The supply chain issues are real. They're real. They're not going to get better with this Chinese lockdowns that they're having. So many materials are used in the process of assembling equipment here in Clackamas County. So I'm very interested in finding out what they have to share. So again, burn those masks, enjoy. We'll have a burn the mask celebration. Enjoy 70 degrees today. The daffodils should be popping open everywhere. And we're glad you're here, and we look forward to seeing you in April.